She is volatile, she is mentally unfit, she is a wanderer with no spouse, no profession, and she hides in a closet-sized flat. My father Richard was shrieking so fiercely that purple ropes bulged in his throat, his complexion a terrifying shade of cherry. He jabbed a quivering finger at me across the courtroom. Just gaze at her, Your Honor. She cannot even articulate. She requires a guardian to oversee her inheritance before she squanders it on whatever unstable people waste currency on. I sat in utter stillness, my palms folded gently in my lap, sneaking a glance at my wristwatch. 10:02 a.m. Right on cue. Judge Sullivan peered at him over her spectacles, her face unreadable. Then she leaned forward and delivered a single freezing question. You genuinely have no idea who she is, do you? At the neighboring table, my father's attorney Bennett halted mid-gesture, his eyes trapped on a document the bailiff had just slipped him. The blood drained from his face so abruptly, I thought he might collapse before I reveal what the judge uncovered that made my father's complexion turn spectral white. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who belongs to our circle. The stillness in that walnut-paneled chamber wasn't empty. It was dense, compressed thrumming with the kind of strain that arrives just before a levee breaks. I didn't glance at my father. I didn't grant him the pleasure of seeing a single tear or a quiver on my lip. Instead, I watched the dust motes dancing in the blade of sunlight hitting the defense table, and I let my thoughts drift back to Christmas Eve just 4 months earlier. We were lounging at the long dining table in his house. The house I was quietly covering the mortgage on. Richard had actually cackled when I handed him my fresh business card. He flung it onto the tablecloth like a used tissue, a consultant he had mocked swirling his pricey scotches. That what we label unemployment these days, Isla? It's an adorable little pastime, sweetheart, but let's be truthful, you're playing dress up. I recalled the flush rising in my cheeks that evening, the familiar sting of being the letdown, the failure, the invisible offspring. But sitting here in court, that memory didn't ache. It felt like kerosene, because while he was sneering at my adorable little hobby between bites of roasted beef, he didn't know that my hobby had just locked in a $15 million federal contract to scrutinize a corrupt pharmaceutical supply chain. He spotted a drifter. I saw the chief executive of Vanguard Holdings, a forensic auditing firm that specializes in tracking down money that desperately wants to stay lost. And right now, the money I was hunting was his. She is catatonic, Richard bellowed, yanking me back to the present. Observe her. She hasn't uttered a word. She's clearly sedated or suffering some kind of breakdown. I demand full conservatorship immediately. I adjusted my cuff, feeling the cool metal of my watch against my wrist. Let him scream, let him portray me as the fragile, shattered little girl who couldn't keep a spouse or a steady address. It was all part of the scheme. If I defended myself now, if I argued back, I would simply be the rebellious daughter fighting her dad. But silence made him appear deranged. Silence allowed him to excavate his own grave so deeply he would never crawl out. He attacked my living situation. Next, she resides in some decrepit rental downtown. He ranted. She refuses to let family visit because she's humiliated by how she exists. It's probably a pigsty. I suppressed a grin. He was talking about the Meridian. He was correct about one thing. I didn't let him visit, but he was mistaken about everything else. I didn't live in a decrepit rental. I lived in the penthouse, and more crucially, I didn't merely rent there. I owned the entire structure. In fact, I owned the building where he rented his office space. I had evicted 3 tenants last month for late payments, and my father, the magnificent legal brain, the titan of commerce, didn't even realize his landlord's signature on the eviction notices was mine. Bennett, his attorney, was now dripping sweat. He was frantically tapping his tablet, scrolling through the document the bailiff had handed him. I knew precisely what he was reading. It was an asset summary, not my grandmother's assets, mine. I wasn't here to battle over an inheritance. I didn't need my grandmother's fortune. I earned more in a single quarter than my father had accumulated in his entire career. I was here because he had tried to steal my liberty. He had attempted to wield the legal system, the very system I had devoted my life to mastering, to erase me, and now he was about to discover that the unstable drifter he had bullied for 29 years was actually the shark gliding through the deep end of his own pool. I looked up, meeting Judge Sullivan's eyes. She gave me the faintest nod. It was time. The snare was laid. Now we just had to let him stroll right into it. Judge Sullivan was flipping through the pages of the financial dossier Bennett had supplied. The rhythmic swish-snap of the paper was the only sound cutting through my father's heavy panting. Richard was still posturing, tugging at his tie, scanning the gallery as if he were a gladiator who had just vanquished a beast. He didn't realize the beast was actually the bank, and the bank was seated 5 feet away from him, wearing a navy blazer and an expression of absolute tedium. I shut my eyes for a second, not to conceal, but to remember. I needed to recall exactly why I was doing this. I needed to remember the day the ledger first opened 2 years ago. Richard's firm was hemorrhaging cash. I knew because I had breached his accounts, not that it required much hacking. His password was Richard won the number one, because he genuinely believed he was the center of the universe. He was 3 months behind on payroll and drowning in predatory loans. He required a lifeline. A normal father would have asked his family for assistance. A humble man would have scaled down. Richard did neither. Instead, he tried to have me institutionalized. It was a Tuesday. I remembered the date because it was the same day I had finalized a massive audit for a tech giant. 2 officers had appeared at my door with an involuntary psychiatric hold order. My father had falsified a statement from a doctor or a buddy from his golf club, claiming I was a danger to myself, that I was delusional, that I was burning through my inheritance on imaginary ventures. He wanted to lock me away for 72 hours so he could file an emergency motion to seize control of my trust fund. He didn't want to rescue me. He wanted to liquidate me to pay his office rent. The officers had left after 5 minutes. One look at my clean apartment, my composed demeanor, and the federal badges of the agents I was on a conference call with was enough to prove the report was malicious. I didn't press charges then. That would have been too swift, too merciful. Instead, I decided to become the solution to his problem and the architect of his nightmare. I created Vanguard Holdings the very next morning, the shell company with a vague name and a registered agent in Delaware. Through Vanguard, I approached his bank. I offered to buy out his toxic debt. The bank was thrilled to unload a failing client. I purchased his loans, his credit lines, everything. Then I injected a fresh $650,000 into his firm under the guise of a private equity angel investor. Richard didn't ask questions. He didn't vet Vanguard. He just saw 6 figures land in his account and assumed the world had finally recognized his brilliance. And what did he do with the money I gave him? Did he pay his staff? Did he upgrade his outdated legal software? No, he bought a vintage Porsche 911 in slate gray. I remembered watching him pull up to Thanksgiving dinner in that car, revving the engine, boasting about his record-breaking quarter. He sat at the head of the table carving the turkey and looked directly at me. Maybe if you applied yourself, Isla, he had said, wine staining his teeth, you wouldn't be such a financial weight on the family legacy. It's embarrassing, really, at your age, needing handouts. I had smiled and eaten my potatoes. I was driving a 5-year-old sedan. He was driving a car paid for by the wait sitting to his left. He thought he was the monarch of the castle, but he hadn't checked the deed. He hadn't read the loan terms. He didn't know that every mile he put on that Porsche was depreciating an asset that already belonged to me. Your Honor. Richard's voice snapped me back to the courtroom. He was leaning on the podium, now regaining his swagger. We are squandering time. My daughter clearly has no assets, no income, and no grip on reality. This silence, it's a defense trick. She's terrified because she knows she is nothing without my backing. I looked at him, truly looked at him. He wasn't a villain. He was just a terrible investment. And today, I was closing the account. Bennett, his lawyer, finally glanced up from the documents. His hands were trembling so violently that the papers rattled against the table. He leaned over and whispered something urgent into Richard's ear. Richard swatted him away like a gnat. Not now, Bennett. I'm making a point. You might want to listen to him. Mr. Caldwell, Judge Sullivan said. Her voice was frost. She held up a single sheet of paper, the summary of Vanguard Holdings' ownership structure. Because according to this, the plaintiff isn't just your daughter. She's your boss. My father didn't gasp. He didn't stammer. He laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound that ricocheted off the wood paneling, shredding the last scrap of dignity he had left. He shook his head, gazing at Judge Sullivan with the kind of condescending pity usually reserved for a confused child. My boss, Richard chuckled, smoothing his tie. Your Honor, I don't know what forgery she slipped into your docket, but this is exactly what I'm talking about. Delusions of grandeur. It's a symptom of her condition. Isla doesn't run a company. Isla can barely operate a toaster. Bennett, his lawyer, made a noise like a dying animal. He grabbed Richard, sleeve his knuckles white. Richard, he hissed, his voice shaking so severely it was audible 3 rows back. Stop, look at the seal. This is a federal incorporation document. It's real, you need to sit down. Richard ripped his arm away. Get off me, Bennett. I'm not going to sit down while my daughter makes a mockery of this court. He turned back to the judge, his confidence morphing into aggression. He jabbed a finger at me again, stabbing the air. Look at her, look at that cheap suit, look at those scuffed shoes. Does that look like a CEO to you? She buys her clothes from discount bins. She drives a sedan with a dent in the bumper. Successful people don't live like refugees, Your Honor. I glanced down at my shoes. He was right, they were scuffed. I had scuffed them climbing through a warehouse window last week to verify inventory for a client. I didn't replace them because I didn't care. Unlike Richard I, didn't need to wear my net worth on my feet. She lives in the Meridian, Richard shouted, thinking he was delivering the fatal blow. That crumbling brick pile downtown. I've seen the address on her mail. She lives in a studio apartment in a building that probably has rats in the walls, and you want me to believe she owns Vanguard Holdings. She can't even afford a doorman. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep my expression flat. The Meridian, he called it a crumbling brick pile. I called it a historic restoration project, and he was right about the rats. When I bought the building 6 months ago, there were rats. I hired the exterminators, I hired the contractors, I renovated the lobby, and I took the entire top floor for myself. He thought I was a tenant in Unit 4B. He didn't know 4B was just the mail drop. I kept to throw him off the trail. This is a waste of taxpayer money, Richard sneered, slamming his hand on the podium. She is unstable. She is alone, no husband, no children, no legacy, just a sad, lonely girl making up stories. Sign the conservatorship decree, Your Honor. Allow me to secure the treatment she desperately needs before she tarnishes this family any further. He stood there, his chest heaving, victorious. He believed he had conquered me. He believed he had unmasked me. He didn't realize that by mocking the crumbling brick pile, he had just insulted his own landlord. Judge Sullivan slowly removed her reading spectacles. She no longer appeared angry. She looked weary, and that was infinitely worse. Mr. Caldwell, she said, her voice hushed and perilously composed. I am going to give you 10 seconds to lower yourself into that chair and seal your lips, because if you utter one more syllable about the plaintiff's psychological state, I will find you in contempt so swiftly your skull will spin. Richard parted his mouth to argue, but Bennett physically wrenched him into his seat. Good, the judge stated. She lifted the next document from the pile. Now that we have heard your opinion, let us examine the evidence, because according to this deed, the crumbling brick pile you just referenced, she doesn't merely reside there. Judge Sullivan slid a single sheet across the polished wood. It stopped mere inches from my father's quivering hand. The Meridian, she said, her tone stripped of emotion. Unit 4B is indeed a mail drop. You were correct about that, Mr. Caldwell. But Miss Caldwell doesn't rent it. She possesses the building, the entire building, including the commercial suites on the 3rd floor. The suites your firm currently occupies. Richard blinked. He stared at the paper, then at me, then back at the judge. His brain was misfiring. That hat's impossible. My landlord is a corporate entity. I pay rent to Vanguard Real Estate. I have never written a check to her. Vanguard, the judge repeated, tasting the word. She reached into the folder once more. Now that is a name that appears quite frequently in these files. Vanguard Real Estate, Vanguard Capital, Vanguard Holdings. She pulled out a thick binder, its spine cracking as she opened it. According to your firm's financial disclosures, Vanguard Holdings is your primary investor. In fact, they are the sole reason your firm remains solvent. They injected $650,000 into your operating account 2 years ago. Is that accurate? Richard straightened his tie, clutching at a scrap of familiar ground. Yes, Vanguard is a private equity angel investor. They recognized the potential in my firm. They acknowledged my legal brilliance and decided to support a champion. They rescued us. He sneered at me. Unlike my daughter, who wouldn't recognize capital investment if it struck her in the face, Vanguard believes in me. I watched him preen. It was almost pitiful. He was boasting about the very rope I had sold him to hang himself with. Vanguard believes in you, the judge echoed. She rotated the binder so he could view the incorporation documents on the first page. That is fascinating, Mr. Caldwell, because the sole incorporator, the chief executive officer, and the primary signatory for Vanguard Holdings is Isla Caldwell. The air evacuated the room. It didn't hiss. It simply vanished. Richard gaped at the signature, at the Bottom of the page, it was my signature, the same one I had scrawled on his birthday cards that he tossed into the rubbish, the same one I had affixed to the lease renewal he had signed last month. Without glancing at it, "No," he whispered, then louder, "No, this is a trick, this is forgery." He swiveled to Bennett, his face contorting into a mask of frantic arrogance. "Bennett, inform her, tell her this is unlawful. She isn't an attorney, she cannot possess a law firm. It violates the American Bar Association Regulations Rule 54. Non-lawyers cannot hold equity in a legal practice. This contract is void." He turned back to me, a manic grin stretching across his features. He thought he had cornered me. He believed he had uncovered the escape hatch. "You foolish girl," he laughed, jabbing a wavering finger at my chest. "You tried to play magnate, but you didn't study your homework. You cannot own my firm. It's illegal. You have just confessed to a regulatory violation in open court. I will have you disbarred or whatever they do to counterfeit accountants." He looked at the judge, exultant. "Dismiss this, Your Honor. She is not my boss. She is a swindler who broke the law to pretend she mattered." I didn't budge. I didn't wince. I simply leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. And finally, for the first time that morning, I spoke. "You are correct," Richard the First said softly. "I cannot own your firm." I rose to my feet. "But you didn't read the contract, did you?" I walked around the defense table, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor. With a deliberate, steady cadence, Bennett recoiled in his chair as I approached, clutching his briefcase like a shield, but Richard didn't retreat. He puffed out his chest, still clinging to his delusion that a technicality would rescue him. "I didn't purchase equity in your firm," Richard the First said, my voice slicing through the stagnant courtroom air. "I know Rule 50, for I memorized the ABA model rules before I even incorporated Vanguard." I stopped directly in front of him, close enough to inhale the stale whiskey on his breath from the night before, close enough to see the sweat beading on his upper lip. "I didn't invest in you," I said, cold and clear. "I bought your debt." I gestured to the judge, who nodded and handed me the thick file of loan agreements. I tossed it onto the table before him. It landed with a heavy thud. "2 years ago, you were drowning," I continued, pacing slowly. "3 banks had rejected your loan applications. You were payroll insolvent. You were about to lose your license for commingling client funds to cover your country club dues." Richard's face twitched. "That was temporary, a cash flow issue. It wasn't equity," I said evenly. "It was insolvency. Vanguard acquired your loan, your credit line, and the lien on your equipment. Then we extended you $650,000 on a senior secured basis." Bennett flinched. He understood. "Am not your partner, Richard. Am your senior secured creditor. I don't own your firm. I own the collateral. Every chair, every laptop, every client file belongs to me. If you default," I pointed to the clause, paragraph 12, section B, "default on character. Insulting your guarantor in a recorded hearing triggers immediate acceleration. You called me incompetent and a fraud. On the record, you defaulted." I checked my watch. "The loan is due now." Richard's face drained. "I don't have that money. I know you have $12,000 in the bank and a maxed out credit card." I turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I am calling a loan. I request an enforcement order to seize assets." Bennett scrambled to his feet. "If you take the equipment, the firm dies." "I accept your resignation," I said flatly. Richard finally erupted, accusing me of treachery and plotting a hostile takeover. Then, desperate, he grabbed his phone. "I anticipated this," he shouted. "Server failsafe. Am filing Chapter 7. Right now." A progress bar appeared on his screen. "Liquidation. Automatic stay. You receive nothing. The firm is deceased." He leaned back, triumphant. "Bankruptcy protects companies," I said quietly, pulling out one final sheet. "Not guarantors." Richard blinked. "You signed a personal guarantee paragraph for Section C cross-collateralization. If the business goes bankrupt, the debt transfers to your personal estate." Silence. "You didn't bankrupt the firm," I said. "You bankrupted yourself. I now hold claims on your house, the cottage, the Porsche, your pension, even your golf club membership." Judge Sullivan brought her gavel down immediately. "Hearing dismissed with prejudice. Asset seizure granted. Mr. Caldwell, 24 hours to vacate your residence. Commercial eviction is immediate." Bennett packed his belongings and fled without a word. Richard remained frozen, small and stunned, staring at the hollow shell of his legacy. I walked out without glancing backward. My victory felt like relief, not exhilaration. That night, I watched the locksmith drill out the lock on the office door. The Caldwell and Associates nameplate dropped into a cardboard box. The liquidation team would handle the remainder. I wouldn't profit, and I didn't care. The $650,000 was never an investment. It was the price of my liberation. At home, I deleted Dad from my phone. Not blocked, deleted, just digits now. I stood by the window, inhaling the silence that had always felt unattainable. Sometimes you don't have to demolish a toxic family, you just have to outlast them.